If you're interested in art, stick around because you're about to see some things you've never seen before, as this must rank as one of the most puzzling and deceptive and exceptional paintings of all time. But just a spoiler alert, this video is a very quick drive-by of the 14 deep and slow episodes that pick the painting apart in painstaking detail. So jump straight to episode 1 if you like your art much slower and in much more depth. There are 3 things I want to deal with in this video, and surprisingly the Vermeer connection is actually the least interesting of them. But I'm going to deal with that first because that's probably what most people are here for. So to answer the question you haven't asked me, do I really think this was painted by Vermeer? My answer is yes, most definitely, and I'm going to show you why, and why it's essentially an unforgeable painting. The only plausible alternative painter that I can come up with is that it was painted by someone unknown who was so intimate with Vermeer's technique that they must have worked alongside him in his studio. And Vermeer wasn't known to have had any students or assistants. Those in the know will assume that this painting is just a small copy of Peter de Hoogh's painting, A Boy Bringing Bread, which is owned by the Wallace Collection in London. That painting has a known provenance and is very definitely authentic. But I'm also going to pop the balloon that this is just a copy, because it isn't. And these paintings are far more different than they appear on the surface. In fact, my painting is hiding a completely different story. First, let's put them side by side. Bear in mind that my painting is very dirty, uncleaned, unrestored, and is covered with dark brown varnish. It's had some overpainting down on the left-hand side, around the floor area, over towards the middle of the floor. And we'll have a look at who might have done that a little bit later. When comparing it to the de Hoogh painting, essentially it has only half the surface area, but it's identical in proportion. So the de Hoogh painting is about a third wider and a third taller than my painting, but that gives it twice the surface area. One of the paintings is obviously based on the other, but they're quite different. Note the high contrast between light and dark areas in my painting, and the way the areas of light draw your eye. There are other minor compositional differences between the paintings, but note in particular that the view through the window in the de Hoogh painting is quite different. His painting, with its very clear coats of arms on the windows, is almost certainly a commission. I can't say for certain which painting came first, but you'll see in a minute just how completely different they really are. Let's park that issue for a minute and ask the obvious question: does my painting even look like a Vermeer? Well, 37 Vermeer paintings have been found so far, and if you were to line them up, you'd say this painting is most similar to his 2 outdoor scenes of Delft. In fact, those 2 paintings are going to give us most of the evidence for this painting. And just as an aside, we know that Vermeer also painted a 3rd painting of either a house or houses in Delft that has become lost. It's unknown, of course, what it looked like, but I think that there is some possibility, at least, that my painting is that painting. And we'll see why that is. This painting at about 51 centimetres high is the same height as about 8 other Vermeer paintings, such as Officer and a Laughing Girl, and at 41 centimetres wide it's about the same width as 4 paintings, such as The Milkmaid, but it doesn't share the 2 dimensions with any other painting. Now that's not unusual with Vermeer's paintings. His painting The Little Street is also an outlier, and in fact it's about 1 inch larger than my painting in both directions. So it's 1 inch taller and 1 inch wider, so about 2.5 centimetres. Another painting that's only recently been firmly attributed to Vermeer is St. Praxedis, and it's interesting that that's almost exactly twice the height and twice the width of my painting. So the proportions of my painting, that is the ratio of height to width that were being used by Vermeer in the mid-1650s to late 1650s, are consistent with my painting. Vermeer painted professionally from effectively the start of 1654 until he died in late 1675, although he isn't thought to have painted very much at all in the last year or 2 of his life. I had my painting carbon dated by slicing a small piece of unpainted linen from the back. The earliest date that process gave was 1666, so even allowing for some error, one way or the other, it's pretty well smack in the middle of Vermeer's career. Just for those technically minded, my painting is unlined linen, has one selvage intact, which has what appear to be lacing holes, has cusping on all 4 sides, has a warp that runs horizontally and a thread count of between 15 and 17 threads per centimetres in both directions. It's been primed in what appears to be a dirty beige or possibly a pale grey. Both colours were used by Vermeer. It appears to have been put onto an adjustable stretcher, with the original stretcher bars having been reused. Now, a fun fact. One of the things that interested me was whether or not the nails were authentic, because nails would have been handmade in Vermeer's time and would have been expensive. Certainly the nails in my painting were all different from each other, and there weren't many of them. I remembered that Vermeer actually painted nails in the wall behind the milkmaid, and a couple of them were very detailed and very unusual. They seemed to have spikes or horns on one side and rough round eruptions on another. I found that I have very similar nails with these strange edges to them, and it's interesting to think just how accurately Vermeer was depicting something as small as a nail. So yes, the age of the painting support of my painting is right, and when we get to the surface we find that that's also very consistent with a very old painting. Vermeer's technique shifted somewhat throughout his career. The paintings that my painting appear to draw from are the Little Street, the View of Delft, and the Procurus. So let's start by looking at the Little Street, which is in the Rijksmuseum, and remember it's about an inch taller and an inch wider than my painting. This is the Google Super Zoom image, and these are fantastic images because you can really get in and have a good look at what's going on. Now, there's been a lot of arguments about where this house is in Delft, or where it was, and it's still a raging debate, but we're going to ignore that and just look at the people in it, and in particular the white walls on this painting and the paving tiles, just to see whether there's any similarities with my painting. The first thing to notice is that of the four people that are in it, they all appear to be very loosely painted superficially, but one of them isn't. And if you zoom in and have a look at the boy is incredibly detailed. Let's have a look at his shoe here just for a second. See this little stud on the back of his shoe, this little round circle? It's a round circle with little bits of sort of fluting around it. And there's another one just on the front here, it's harder to see, and a little lump on the side. These are really odd shoes, and one of the things I'm going to put to you is that the shoes the boy's wearing in my painting are really quite similar. You can even see a little button there on the edge of his shoe where there's some sort of a strap, and another strap just here going through a loop. Now, to give you some context, that's only about 1 millimetre across there. Look at this painting at actual size, if you can, and you won't be able to see these things at all. So one of the arguments I'll be making is that Vermeer, when he painted, must have used an optical device to magnify the image. You can't paint what you can't see, and I can tell you that you can't see this, and you certainly can't see that. So I think it's worth having a bit of a look at. You can see a garter strap of some sort around the top of his shin there as well. I'm in two minds about what this is on his knees. I'd like to say it's a basket, possibly because my boy's got a basket, but it might not be. It might be a part of an apron, although I think this is an under apron here, and this could well be a basket still sitting on his knee, because you can see what looks like a rope running across here, and I think it's connecting to something, and I think that something might be on the edge of the basket here. And when we look at my boy in a bit more detail, we'll see that there's a rope that is exactly at that spot. The other thing that I'll just point out quickly about the boy, see these ridges? I have to go out a little bit so you can see them more clearly on his elbow. Very unusual things on his arm and elbow coming down. So this jacket is possibly some sort of embossed leather. There's also a rosette. If you look really carefully here, you'll see a shape here. It's not a rosette, but possibly a sort of a leaf shape. See it running around there, and you'll see a little dot in the middle of it, like a big leaf. I don't think it's on his arm. I think it's on the stomach part of the tunic, and that also is something that I seem to have on my painting, which is these strange sort of leather embossed horns that stick out of the front of the jacket that seem to have some sort of a mechanism that helps you hold the basket. Now, you can't see the boy's face at all. It's basically disappeared into shadow, and he seems to be wearing a large hat. But it's just the detailing on him that's incredible, and you don't actually notice it, and I haven't seen any commentary on it. The girl doesn't have much detail. I think she's got a little purse here at the side of her back, but the boy is quite inconsistent with the other people. He's actually got a lot more going on. But that's not the first thing I want to point out in terms of similarities. What we're looking at now is similarities in paint technique. And the first one to look at, I think, is the paving slabs. In the little street, you can see that he's used grey, he's used this pale terracotta colour, and he's used a bit of cream. And note that the colours shift as he goes across horizontally, and they shift vertically as well. Now, we'll come back to my painting and have a look at the same thing. So if we look at the floor tiles in my painting, you can see they actually fade off to nothing in the distance. The undercolour seems to be this yellowy colour because he's out in a sun-filled courtyard. In the little street, the light's a little bit more muted. It is a fine day, but it's not sunny as such, or not super sunny, because the shadows are not particularly strong in it, apart from the very dark shadow under the boy's hat. The rest of the shadows are quite weak. So you can see that there's this yellow colour here, and a little bit of the terracotta comes in as it comes towards the front, and then more and more and more. So he shifts the colour that way, and you can see the same with the cream on the alternate tiles. It picks up a little bit of terracotta as it starts to go across there, then loses it again, and then it shifts into just yellow. And you can also see that there's a horizontal colour movement as well. You can see there it runs yellow, a bit more terracotta, and back to yellow again. So there's this movement of colour with three different colours being interposed. Different colours, only slightly different. I think two of them are the same, but one's different. And I think that's just because it's a sunny courtyard. But it's a completely different technique from De Hoog, who makes every tile consistent all the way up to the edge there, and he makes them all visible. So he just uses colours and just alternates them. It's a completely different technique. We go back to the little street. The next thing I want to point out is how the white is used when it comes up against, say, a piece of woodwork. And you just see how easy and lazy it almost is, how confident the artist is, that he actually just doesn't worry about exactly where the edges are. He knows that your eye sort of picks out edges anyway, so he just blends it towards the edge, completely unconcerned about overpainting edges or whatever. Bits of paint just sticking out in all sorts of places. And it's clearly this really thick white that he's put on at the end has been painted over the top anyway, so it's probably been a little bit harder to control because it's probably thick and oily by the look of the shine in it. But just completely unconcerned about edges. He increases and reduces the thickness as he goes along. You can see the brush strokes are incredibly free. Let's go across to have a look at around this edge here. Is a really interesting edge just as he gets on towards the edge of the brickwork. You can see how oily this paint is and how loose it is, just completely loosely splotched on, but just incredible effect at the end of it, of this absolutely shimmering white sort of translucency. So let's go back and look at my painting, and you can see almost exactly the same thing. Where a piece of woodwork has come up against the bricks or the window, it's just complete indifference about where the edges are, but this thick overpaint on the top of it, different colours of course, but absolutely the same technique. And you can see in the wall here how the brush strokes are going every which way. There's an undercolour which is which looks like, let's try and pick it out in this corner. You can see the undercolour here, and then over the top he's just hit it with this other creamy yellowy white overpaint, and not been at all concerned about where his edges are. See just how loose and easy the whole thing is. Almost exactly the same technique. I don't think there would have been too many painters of that era that would have been painting this freely and easily. Obviously he had complete confidence about what he was painting, I can't pick out underpainting in this part of it. There's certainly underpainting where the people are, but I can't pick out much underpainting here. Very, very similar, almost frankly identical technique to the little street. And the brush work almost looks exactly the same, just any old which way, sort of this slight translucency to it. The white, when you get down along this edge of the floor tiles, as I mentioned earlier, some of this white down below here has been overpainted, but I think this is the artist's original white running across here. And you just have a look at the how free this is across the top and how shimmering this is. You can see it's got a bit of pink in it there. He's put a bit of pink in the white, and a bit of pink over here, and perhaps a bit of yellow as well. But really incredibly, I just love the brightness that's just hitting in between the boy's legs there. Really incredibly free brush strokes, and this shimmering light, just like you get along those edges of those brickworks. You can see through it. It's transparent, or translucent at least. He's not worried about that. He's come along and added this in right at the end of his painting. The next thing I want to point out to you is, let's have a look at the woman's bonnet in Vermeer's Little Street. Again, it's this white that's translucent, but just have a look at the different colours that are going on here. And notice that as he gets towards the edge, he's widened out his brush strokes a little bit, and which creates a shadow. So I think all he's done here is he's just plonked this white over the top of whatever was underneath and just broadened out his brush strokes, or thinned the paint a bit at that point. You can see it's a bit thicker in the middle here, and that's created a edge shadow just around there. And on this side you'll notice that there's pink with the white here, and then if we get into the back of it, you'll see that there's a bit of green there. And there's actually a bit of green just on this edge here and along there, and I'm wondering whether or not this face was underpainted with green, because certainly the two faces in my painting are underpainted with green. It's this dull green colour, probably green earth I think it's called, which I understand is an Italian technique which was designed to stop the colour of the face, the flesh tones, from becoming too burnt out and too bright. So I believe that Vermeer would have been one of the few people that might have used that on occasion, but he certainly was known to use green in the shadows of his paintings of faces in the later part of his career, but there's certainly green being used in the shadow area in this painting, which is in the early part of his career, so I'm not quite sure how all that fits together, but that's not my problem. All I'm pointing out is that there's just the way it's been painted, this translucency on the edge, the use of the pink and the use of the green. Now I'll have a look at my painting, and this is the boy's bonnet in my painting, and you'll notice immediately that he's got this white, which is reasonably thick in this point. It becomes a bit more transparent as it heads towards the shadow side of the head, and he just painted a completely different colour underneath here and different colour underneath there. So he's got this greenish colour here, this greenish white here, and then he's got the overpaint of white on the top, which is thick in some areas and tapers towards the edges. Not concerned at all about where it ends by the look of it, although we might come back and have a quick look at what's going on with the boy's head later on. But you can see, again, very similar treatment and the same colours, but he's in bright sunlight, so there's no pink in this part of it. But if we go down to the boy's shoulder, you can see that he's used pink in the white as well here, so it's exactly the same as he's used in that woman's bonnet. He's used that same sort of pink as well. This is the same pink that was down in the white in the doorway. You can see a little bit of yellow in the underpaint colour, and again it's this completely free and easy translucent and transparent white. It's just been dropped over the top very casually, but to create a really interesting light effect on the boy's shoulder. The same over here as well. While we're looking at this shoulder pad, let's have a quick look at the woman's shoulder pad in the little street. The woman in the little street, you can see, has some sort of a white shawl or something around. Again, it's these incredibly loose strokes but quite thick white paint towards the middle, but again very free brush strokes. And as you head over towards her shoulder, you can see the pink that is used, and I can depict a little bit of green in the back here as well. I think I might be wrong, but it looks a bit like green to me. In fact, it does look to me like she's got green underpaint under her face as well, which would make it pretty well identical to my painting, but in fact there seems to be a bit more green down here. So under all of these flesh tones, he looks like he's put this green. In fact, it might be under the whole thing by the look of it. You can see, I think, that this is very, very similar to what I have in my painting. And so the next painting I want to make some comparisons with is Vermeer's View of Delft, which is a Mauritshuis painting. It's about 3 times the width of my painting, so it's a much bigger painting. And the things I want to particularly note are the terracotta colour that's used in various parts of the painting, and the highlights that are used on parts of the painting, as well as what actually happens when the sun hits directly onto a part of a building. And this is the only painting that Vermeer painted where the sunlight hits something directly. So we're going to have a look at those few items. Of course, most of this painting is taken up by sky and the smooth water, but it's these textural buildings that I particularly want to look at, and the foreground. So let's just have a quick look at this little boat that's down here. And Vermeer, of course, in his later years was seen as a detailed and fine painter, painting particularly fine and detailed paintings of women in interiors. But this painting shows you just how loose and free his technique was in the earlier part of his career. What I want to point out in this one is just look at the broken technique on the terracotta. It's just not painted as one block of terracotta. It's got little light effects all over it, so the light is changing on it. Now we'll have a look at my painting. And if we look at the terracotta floor that's down underneath the chair in the painting, you can see all of this broken colour again. Now, I think there's actually quite a lot going on this area, which I haven't totally worked out what all of these little marks are, because I think there's something else being depicted. You can see a little bit of it here with these silver objects. So there's certainly something more happening, which is possibly hidden by dirt or hidden deliberately by the artist. The main thing to note is that in the View of Delft, I think he's just used a white underpaint under the terracotta, and then he's lightened up where he's highlighted just with touches of colour. In this one, I think the underpaint is actually yellow, and there's a little yellow triangle just here. You can sort of just pick it up. It's a bit blurry there, but there's quite a bright yellow underpainting in this area, and that's because I think this is the dominant colour in this part of the room. The sun's coming through these windows and flooding this with light, and what he does is he picks up that yellow and uses that as his underpaint, and it's also, I think, the underpaint on the cushion of the chair that we'll have a look at later as well. So while we're here, let's just have a look at the front of the chair, and you'll see there's terracotta being used in the highlights of the bottom rail, with looks like a couple of little yellow dots here and there. As it comes up the leg, there's sort of a very pale terracotta with some yellow dots. There's some big swirls of light and dots and streaks of yellow and yellow sort of green colour, again on just the side rail there. Then when he gets to the top rail, it's cream. So he's got a sort of a cream highlight along it. So he's used 3 different colours on the front of that chair. Now let's just have a look at the View of Delft, where he also uses lots of different colours in his highlights. It's a bit hard to know whether the boat actually here did have a blue front to it or not, of course. But if you have a look at that colour at the top there, that's definitely just a sort of a highlighted rail, and you can see the technique that he's used, but it's virtually the same colour that I've got on the top of my chair. And then he's used a cream here, and he's got the blue there. And if we go across and have a look at another boat over here, you'll also see that he's used very similar sorts of technique. You'd have to assume that there's perhaps a blue painted rail along there. It's a bit hard to tell whether it's just a highlight, and then he's got a different blue, and then he's got a terracotta-y colour down the bottom, and he's got some yellow dots. So you've got this terracotta, yellow, dirty cream colour. But the colour on my chair is pretty much this colour here on one of the rails. So it's that taupey colour. So again, similar techniques, different size paintings. So what you're seeing with different size paintings, of course, is quite often you're seeing the features that I'm pointing out will be at a different scale. So brush marks might be further apart or closer together, just depending on what we're looking at. The next thing I want to point out is just how the arch has been painted. It's, again, very similar, sort of these twisting brush strokes and splotches of colour rather than painting absolutely crisp edges. And you'll see these big white dots and a little bit of the taupey colour next to it, and then a bit of brown around the feature on the top of the archway. No great concern about the way it is. I'm not sure whether those brown marks on this edge are correct or not. They might have been overpainted. There's certainly some underpainting that's visible here, and it's quite detailed underpainting as well, so that's something that needs to be looked at quite separately. But you can see just the way that the brown here is just curved and twisted, and a slightly different colour there, a bit more pink in it there, and sort of a lighter brown underpaint under the whole thing. So we go back to the view of Delft, and you see very similar sorts of paint treatment, just dots and splotches and very similar colours, quite casual. Obviously this is a rough wall, and he seems to have a lot of sand or something in it, which he's picking up little highlights. I've got quite a bit of sand in my painting as well, or something that's, down in the bottom of my painting there's an area that looks a bit like a stone graveyard. It's got all these little bits of coloured stone or sand or something. It's quite unusual, as if they were storing them up for something. But really odd way of painting. But you can see, I think, just the casual use of colours. This is a very bold painting, even in Vermeer. Amongst Vermeer's paintings, it's this wall technique that he's used is probably pretty unique among all of his paintings. And these dots of light, this seems to be the painting where he's actually used them the most. He used them a little bit in the Milkmaid and in the earlier paintings. They don't appear at all, well, not that I can see, but he picks them up in these. This painting in particular, you can see again he's really casual window frame, just a bit of white streak. Mine's very similar to that as well when you get over in the window frame in the back. Let's have a look at sunlight hitting the wall. Proust made something of this in one of his novels. He seems to have referred to it as a bit of yellow light on a wall, but in fact it's yellow light on a roof. Just note that the or the pink colour rather is been overpainted with the yellow. This is the base colour is this pink colour. He reverses this here and there in other areas. Obviously he's got a limited palette. And in other areas you'll find that he's done the reverse of colours, so that's how he creates so many different colours on this wall. But just notice see these red dots or deeper colour dots within this salmon pink colour, and just note this yellow colour. And then you come back to my painting. So don't forget, this is the only time that Vermeer ever painted sunlight hitting a wall directly. And so what colours are in my painting when sunlight hits a wall directly? It's just the same colours. Perhaps a slightly darker yellow, but it's a bit hard to see through the colour of the varnish that's on mine. But also notice the way that this salmon colour, it's been painted over the top of the yellow in this instance. In the other painting is the reverse. But you can see there's darker and lighter bits of it, and you can see there's nothing underneath. There's a damage to the painting. There's nothing underneath, so whoever's painted this, I can't see that they've cleaned another painting off the surface of this. They've just painted it directly onto a prepared canvas, and they've decided to hit it with those two colours. You can see he's kept a little bit of that colour where it goes into the white. The next thing I want to draw your attention to is really more of a colour combination, which is very unusual. This is the front of the chair that we've been looking at the three different coloured highlights, but if you look at this left leg, you see that there's this pinky red colour, perhaps terracotta. It's a little bit different from the colour below, perhaps. You see that's more the terracotta colour, and this has got a bit more, it seems a lot lighter, perhaps a bit more pink. And then it crosses over the yellow in various spots, these yellow dots, and it sort of brightens it right up. And it's next to a grey-green colour. Now this colour here is a bit indeterminate, but let's just look closely at those three combinations of colours, because there's another painting of Vermeer's that has exactly the same colour combination. It's a very unusual combination, having this red with the yellow with the grey colour. This is the Procurus, and the photograph that's in front of you is a Wikimedia Commons photograph. It's a bit different from the Google's super zoom image, for strangely enough, generally the Google images are better, but this one, in this case, shows a couple of things that aren't in the Google image, I think. And I'll just show you what they are. In Vermeer's hair, or in the hair of this man, and this man's often been regarded as being Vermeer because he's looking directly out at us, and he's slightly separated from the other people. There's a scene of a woman who's presumably a prostitute. This is a man flipping money into a hand, and this is the mistress. It looks like a man, but it's actually a woman. And this man in his split jacket here looks very much like the way Vermeer depicts himself in his other painting, large painting of himself, which is The Art of Painting, where he paints himself from the back. It might not be him, but I tend to think it could well be. But what I want to show you is this little colour combination on the side here, which is highly unusual. Again, it's this yellow, this pink and this grey, where they intersect with each other and overlap. And this particular jewellery as well, which is sort of quite unusual. So let's just go back to my painting again and have a look at how similar these colours are, and I'll do a bit of an overlay so you can see the two side by side. I would have thought this is quite an unusual and unique colour combination, but there it is in my painting, and it's also in a Vermeer painting. So just a coincidence perhaps, but an unusual one. And I think there is a jewel just here too on the chair, and there's reason why there'd be jewels on this chair, and we'll have a look at that down the track. It's not very clear, admittedly, but I think there's a black stone with a silver surround just there. Now, it's a bit of a bonus bit of information that compares this painting to the paintings of Vermeer. I want to draw your attention to this little strip of daylight just down the door jamb here. You'll see it in this instance, it's graduated from the dark at the top, and obviously as the light starts to hit the door, it brightens and brightens till it just about gets to the woman where it's white. And the apron, interestingly, does the opposite. It does the reverse as it gets up towards the centre. So he's emphasising that the light is really strongest right in the middle of this painting. And this graduation of light on the edge of a door frame in particular was apparently very unusual. And I'll play you a clip from YouTube of Walter Liedtke, who was an art historian, curator of Dutch and Flemish paintings at the Metropolitan Museum of Art until he was killed in a train accident in America in 2015. Here he is in this little snippet of a lecture talking to the New York Studio School, and he makes mention of this zip of daylight on the edge of a door frame using Vermeer's painting A Maid, or A Girl Asleep as it's now called.
Window against the table in the back of the room. All of these things are, I think, exquisitely balanced with his own sense of proportion. But then you turn to these zips of daylight on the door, and there's no source in that in art for that, I think, and really remarkable. I can't think of anything beforehand in Dutch painting or elsewhere that looks quite like that blinding flash of white light on the door jamb, and can't think of much else until you get up to Manet and Degas, I would say.
So if I put the two paintings side by side, you can see that my painting has this zip of daylight on the edge of the door, and indeed the reverse on the woman's apron. And, of course, A Girl Asleep also has a very similar zip of daylight. And Liedtke says that this is unique to Vermeer. So that's an interesting comment that seems to have some bearing on my little painting. Just before we get to the second part of this introduction, which is when I think things get a lot more interesting when I actually tell you what this painting is actually depicting, which I think will surprise you, we just want to have a quick look at names and signatures that appear on the painting. Now, the reality is, of course, that signatures don't make Vermeer's Vermeer, of course. Only him and his paint technique make them into Vermeers. Nevertheless, signatures are interesting, and I think they're worth having a look at. How much we can rely on any of them remains to be seen. So this is the back of the painting. Let's just have I mentioned that the nails were a little bit interesting. You'll see one of the strange shaped nails there, and you see these little explosions of, they must have a lot of iron or carbon in them or something, and it breaks out of the, on one edge, and you'll see it over in this one as well, just a little rough rippling around that edge. But see how they're all quite different shapes. But I'm not going to focus too much on that. I'll show you the cusping while we're here. You can see this sway of the cusp as it goes across. The fabric is pulled down and then locked in by the treatment of the top of the painting, or the surface of the painting. It gets locked in by it, and you'll see it at the top as well. You see these sways. Now it also is down the sides. It's far less down the sides than it is at the top and the bottom, but it is down the sides. We're going to have a look at mainly signatures in this little bit, but this little drawing at the front at the top is interesting. I tried to compare it to some of the folds of fabric in various Vermeer paintings, thinking maybe he was trying out a bit of hair or fabric, because this looked a bit like a fabric fold to me. But I'm wondering whether that's actually a hand now, whether this is some sort of a hand study. Anyway, I don't know what it is, but it could just be someone cleaning their brush for all I know. But it looks like it's something interesting anyway. Now the oldest marks on the painting appear to be this label, which is at the top centre, and you can see that, look at the label, in reality could have been placed on at any age, of course, and I've got no way of telling, but if the marks on it have been written in iron gall ink, I suspect that someone will be able to work out what they actually say. And you might see in the top right hand corner there's a name. I think there's a date just in that little bit there. It looks like it might say something 67 or whatever. It looks like a 9-3 there, but there's also another name just there on that little bit of remnant that's survived. So there's two names on this old label, and I think that an expert would be able to work out what they say. So they could be quite interesting. I did speculate in the series whether or not this name is Decius, only because that looks like a D that it starts with, and then the next two letters look like S's. Of course, Decius inherited a large number of Vermeer paintings from his wife and from his wife's parents, and they were sold at Amsterdam late in the 17th century after Decius died. So it just seemed to be a little bit coincidental, whether that's a D and a couple of S's, but really I'm only speculating. I've got no idea. But hopefully someone would be able to work that out. There's a few chalk marks on here which are of maybe of some interest. They might relate to some auction or something. But the other thing that's of interest is this little label here from Lever Gallery in Bournemouth when their telephone number was 465. And I'm guessing that this was a label from the early 20th century, probably sometime between 1910, say, and about 1940. So that's the names that are on the back of the painting. There's some other marks and pencil marks and things on the side that, and there's a possible address or name at the top here, which seems to either be a name or a date or something, which is written in pencil from memory and about this area. Now, in terms of the Vermeer connection to this painting, if any, there's a couple of possible signatures. In fact, there's as many as three. There's one, this is the first one I noticed, down on the floor, right in front of the boy, it's been overpainted. I think overpaint, I think that's the artist's original paint there, and this white here, and that looks possibly original. Then you see some strange paint start to come in, and there's some strange edges here that have been painted that don't belong. There's another signature over there we're going to come to, which is clearly a later signature, and all this seems to have been overpainted as well. Obviously, if anyone had any suspicion that this was a Vermeer, they would certainly not have overpainted this area of the painting, which makes me think that this might have been done in the late 1800s or early 1900s, before Vermeer was a thing. But let's just have a look at what it looks like, and you can see that the paint definitely runs across the top of it. But when you get back a little bit, this appears to be an R with a flourish under it, and this appears to be a bit like an M with that the way Vermeer used to write his M, V, and had the I or J in the middle of it. This is not the clearest image of it. When you light it from the left, it shows up a bit clearer, and I'll show you what appears in these marks as well. But before we leave this image, I'll just show you the other thing that I think is a signature, or at least was going to be a signature, and it's above the woman's head here on the wall. Now, I didn't notice this for some years until I looked at a photograph of the painting, and it showed up a lot clearer because I'd pushed the contrast a little bit more. But I think that's an R on the end there, and I think this is an M over here, and there's an I, a dot, and a V, and the V is joined to the M. And in between you can see a very faint couple of shades which could be E's. Certainly the second one's a bit clearer than the first. Now, this is done in the same colour as this wall, so it's been painted at the same time, and it looks like he's just dragged a brush through it. So whether it's intentional or not, or whether he was thinking about putting a signature on that wall and didn't proceed with it, I don't know. But it certainly shows up as appearing to be an M and an R, a V and the I, and the E's, if they're there, are very faint. So that's the second possible Vermeer signature. There is something on the floor down here which has been overpainted as well, and at times those marks there show up as if they're a name, but I can't work out what they are, and in a whole lot of different photographs they show up differently, so I'm very uncertain whether it is a name, but it's a possible name on two lines there. Now, there is another signature on this painting of an English artist, and it's John Henry, it's J. Henry Inskip. Now, I'll show you a close-up of that, but I believe it's a much later signature because the paint has run into the cracks of the painting. And I think the signature's actually been repeated here in giant letters as well. And my speculation is that this might have been done by Inskip when he was quite young. His father was an art dealer, and perhaps he did the touch up on this painting because it's been repainted a bit you can see on the left-hand edge here, this brown has obviously been repainted. That would have been paint that's completely chipped off like the corners, so it would have been showing just the canvas. Someone's come back and touched it up with brown, and I think he's hit it with this white colour, and I think he's possibly been the person who's drawn these lines in. Look at this one here, doesn't even go in a straight line, so it runs off at an angle. You can actually see what looks like it's probably the edge of the tile just running there, so he's completely missed it, but he's whacked a couple of colours over the top. I think he's tried perhaps writing his name in very big letters just there, and he's written it pretty much the way he signed his signature there. Now, Inskip went on to be a reasonably well-known painter, and a painter with a good reputation. I don't believe he would have done this late in his career, so it's either not been done by him at all and someone else has put his name on it, or he's done it when he was very young and an art student, perhaps for his father, and perhaps working as a sort of a art restorer while he was at school, perhaps. But that's just speculation. I don't know. I mean, I don't think there's any possibility that Inskip painted this painting, but as to how his name got on here and who did this these daubs down elsewhere, it's a bit hard to know. So the thing that I think could be the first signature is a bit unusual because it has a straight line at the left-hand side, and it has a little bump here. But when I looked at it in very low light, this seemed to turn into a date, and that seemed to say with a curve around it, etc., and a bump over the top there. And this turned into 2 5s, and it looked like 1655. Now, I'll show you that image in a second, but first of all, that's where the R is there, and you can see the level of overpainting on the top of it. Just to get an idea of what I think the Inskip stuff has added, it's this orange colour, not the yellow colour. So I think these are all additive, and obviously this paint over the top is as well. Just want to point out one thing which is fairly interesting, which is this object that runs across here, and it seems to perhaps be a bit mechanical, and it seems to have some adjusting knobs or something on it here. I've not been able to work out what it is. I thought it was perhaps an upside down reflection of a chandelier at one stage, but just notice where it intersects with the M, there's this large droplet, and it's got reflections painted in it. Now, what this is, it seems to have a slight silver frame just there, and there's a bit there, but it's been hit over the top with this paint as well. But it looks to me like an absolutely exquisite reflection into liquid. And I thought, okay, perhaps this is some device for, dropping paint, and he's showing us how he painted some minute things that we're going to have a look at later. But more lately I've been thinking that maybe this is a big lump of glass that's set into some sort of a frame here, and that also would fit with one of the theories that I've got going on, which is that some of this painting was painted under magnification, and I'm just wondering whether this is sort of some big lump of glass. I'll just show it to you in another image. So that's it up there. I don't know if this is any better. It might actually be worse. I think you can see it's sort of quite a distinct shape at the bottom, and seems to have some sort of an odd shape at the top, and somehow perhaps connects to this device, whatever this thing is. I'll just go back to that earlier image because I want to show you what else is going on down in this area. So that's where I think that signature possibly is. But if we have a look in this area here, you can see some strange marks that look like writing as well. And they seem to have, I don't know, patterning around them of some sort. So they're fairly interesting. This one here looks like it's actually a leaf shape. Now, the other thing I found when I looked at this was what I believe is tiny writing just here. And if you look just there, let's go into slightly larger, you'll see what looks like a J and half of an O. There's a loop at the top, and there's an A, and then there's 3 legs. Then you've got a bit of an indeterminate shape, then an E, which goes up and comes down. Now, I'll show that a bit clearer, or a lot clearer, in the longer series, but I think there's some possibility that says Johann Meer. I can't say for sure. It's absolutely minuscule, but it does definitely look like writing to me. Now, it could be some visual aberration, but it's pretty unusual. All this stuff is pretty unusual, actually, you've got to say, as is this thing. And I thought this might have been a date up here at one stage, but I don't think it is. Anyway, I don't want to spend too long on this. This is supposed to be a summary of what's in the main series, but I find this whole area sort of fascinating. So just having a look at the main Inskip signature down the bottom left of the painting, you can see, first of all, the colour of the painting underneath is one colour. It's sort of a greeny yellow. And then Inskip's signature looks like it's over the top of that, and then there's this grey colour being put over the top of that, and blue line, and then that black line that I showed you, this bit of cream, etc. All of this appears just to be overpainted. But even when you look at the Inskip signature, you can see where it's run across a crack, wherever it runs across a crack, the orange paint has run into the crack. So these cracks were there long before Inskip put his name on the painting, if he did indeed put his own name on and someone else didn't do it for him. And you can see also there that even these lines, of course, are all added later. So this painting was old and cracked long before these names and these lines and marks were put on it. So I'm pretty confident that this has nothing to do with Inskip. But it is interesting to have a look at the original colour of the painting down here and imagine what these floor tiles should actually look like, which is very significantly different from the way they look at the moment. One of the difficulties with this painting will be whether or not this overpaint can ever be cleaned off, because we're about to hit the interesting part where we're going to see a lot of very fine painting. And I'm a bit worried, or in fact very worried, that if this varnish was ever stripped off the top and this paint was stripped off, whether we wouldn't lose all of those things as well. But of course that would then let us see what these details are that have been painted over down underneath here, which could be very interesting, and see things like this, which are some sort of looks like a gun, but it's got a flame halfway along it, so it's a strange sort of shape, the literal smoking gun. All of these things obviously are going into much more detail in the longer series, but that's worth pointing out that Inskip's signature is almost certainly a later edition. In fact, is certainly a later edition, as are all these other marks over the top. So when you take that first signature that I believe I found on the floor into a photo editor and enhance the shadows and contrast in it, I mean, you wind up with this extremely pixelated image by pushing everything too far. But this is the mark that looks like the R, which has sort of got a bit of a loop over the top there. And this is the mark that looks like the M. It's an outside of the right leg and the inside of the right leg. It's lost a bit of this leg, but you see a little bit of a bump there, which is unusual, and this shepherd's crook at the top. But it's the two marks in between that I want to look at, and you see this one here has a bit of a circular shape there and a slight curve up here, and this one also has a bit of an underline there and a curved shape and a sort of a thick back running around there. So of all the marks that they could look like, they look like two E's in between. So, I'm speculating that this is a signature. There seems to be a bit of a sinuous line there that loops across the whole bottom of the thing, which would be unusual for Vermeer, although I think in the love letter there are remnants of a line underneath his signature. So it's interesting marks anyway. Now I'll show you what the date mark looks like, because this appears to turn into a date, or this M does, under very low light. And also just bear in mind that this mark is much clearer to see if you light the painting from the left, as is the other thing that looks like a signature up above the woman's head on the wall. You can't see it if you light it from the right. If you light it from the left, it actually seems to appear. I'll show you that in a minute, but I'll just go to this date mark first. Now this is where the left side of the M is. The right side of it is somewhere in this slope, somewhere just in there. But as you can see, you've got, if you assume that that's a straight line, this is where that little bump is. That's a strange bump that's at the top of what looks like an M, and it does appear that it could be the top of a 6, because these definitely look like 5 and a 5. It's perhaps just pure coincidence. It's a strange coincidence though, because it is contained basically within that mark that looks like the M, and the date is probably just a little bit early for this painting, but who knows, it could be actually a correct date. Just a very strange coincidence to find, particularly that bump at the top that is anomalous on the mark that looks like the M. It has an explanation if that is a 6. Anyway, it's speculative but interesting. What happened was I took this photo with the painting just about in a dark room. I was trying to see this mark and it was showing up more clearly the darker the room got. So it is speculative whether it actually is a date, but it's funny that it would come out being pretty close to the period that I think the painting might come from. So this is a recording of a very wobbly video that I just took of the photograph of this section of the painting, and you can see the mark that looks like the R there. It has a knob on the end and a straight line there and a bit of a flourish underneath. You can see a virtual oops, you can see the curve of what looks like an E. This is the M shape over here. Might be easier if I just stop this for a second. This is the M shape here. These two white marks are just damage on the painting, so they make the letters look very long. But yeah, you can see the R mark there with a knob on the end of the R and what looks like a straight line underneath it. You can see a bit of a loop there. Now this one's a bit strange because it looks like a little E, doesn't it? But I'm not quite sure. It's probably just the top of the loop, and I don't know where the rest of it goes. This is the mark that I think looks like an M, and it has a little diamond in the middle of it, which is identical in terms of the diamond, or the little mark in between the two sides of the M to the little street. It has, and this signature in fact is a signature, looks very much like the little street signature, except that that's a very abraded signature. And then this side of the M, I believe, goes into a V, and you'll see an I with a dot in it over here. And these two marks at the bottom are just a bit of damage on the painting. So let's just have a look at that in the video again and see if you can pick that up. I think you can see at least why I think it looks like a signature. Whether it is or not is difficult to tell, but it's just such a coincidental mark again. But maybe I'm overseeing things, but that R with this little angle and going across to this knob is very distinctive. Of course, the reality is that signatures don't actually make paintings authentic. All they are is additive to the technique of the artist. So the marks that I found on the painting that could be signatures do add to the story, of course, but I don't think in any way that they determine whether or not the painting's authentic. But they certainly are interesting marks, and they're at least pointing in the right direction. So I've shown you a number of references to Vermeer's technique, particularly from paintings in the mid to late 1650s. But now I just want to point out the things that you've probably seen in the painting that don't look correct, and want to address those down the track. I guess first of all, you might be wondering, is this woman actually even wearing an apron? In De Hoog's painting, she has an apron, and it's very sort of high-waisted. It does up here somewhere. And you might wonder, well, what are these strange marks on this painting on the edge that's catching a little bit of sun here? Is she actually even wearing an apron? That looks all a bit strange. And then you'd say, well, this dress looks a bit strange. This skirt has got sort of a hole in it here. What's going on there? It looks like, what's this yellow mark and this hole in her dress? Why does it appear to be transparent? That looks a bit strange. And the boy's face, you might have concluded, looks very strange. It's very patchy. Why has this kid got such a patchy looking face? So you might say, well, that's a bit unusual as well. And the other thing that you'd probably notice that's completely different from Vermeer's other paintings, or from Vermeer's paintings, I shouldn't say Vermeer's other paintings because we don't know who painted this yet, is this chair. What's it got this big swollen belly of a seat on it for? That seems a very unusual depiction. All of his chairs are finely painted, and I think we can see that this is finely painted. You're starting to get the elements of these monumental finials that are on it. The other finials on his chairs are much smaller. They're probably only about this high. These are absolutely monumental. This one's quite blurred out, and I think it's just dirt over the top of it that's just obscuring it. But they look very, very strange. So we'll deal with all those things, and let's deal with a couple of other strange things while we're here, or at least mention a couple of other strange things. And they are things that set this painting a bit apart from De Hoog's painting, because there's an object on the left side of this chair here, and if you look closely you'll just pick up some of the light shining on it. I don't know what it is, I've got to say, but it extends upwards up the painting, and we'll have a bit of a look at how far that extends. The other thing that's a bit strange on the woman's skirt is that there's lines that come across this wall, and they appear to go underneath the paint on the woman's skirt, And you might say, well, there's certainly another painting underneath this painting. But I don't think that's the case. I think what you're seeing there is exactly what you're supposed to see. And I'll explain what those lines are. And just finally, I'm not going to go into every bit of detail on this, but there's another object down here, which again I don't know what it is. But I go into some detail on it in the longer series. I've got some idea what it's doing, but I don't know exactly what it is. And so I think it's now time to explain to you what I think this painting actually is all about. And it's not about a woman in a doorway and a boy with a basket of apples. In fact, while that's the genre painting, the painting of everyday life that it appears to be, it's actually hiding another story. And the other story is a history story, a mythological story. Obviously, it's a very ancient story. And the apple is a bit of a clue to it. And it's not Adam and Eve or anything like that, but it is a story all about sin. And it starts with this painting up on the wall. And the painting, I believe, depicts an empty throne. And this chair, I believe, is a magic chair. Now, I'll show you why that's the case in a little bit of detail, but the bulk of the detail is in the longer series. It's got a shadow here, which I think is a hinged shadow, and it's possible this thing on the other side could relate to it as well, but I don't necessarily think so. But it's an absolutely beautifully detailed chair. We just can't see it properly. You can see almost like a spiral curve there of something hanging off it. There's all sorts of things hanging off it, and there's silver objects down on the ground, etc. I'll show you what this cushion is in this little introduction, but I can't go into all the other detail except to say that I think we'll find that this is quite a spectacular chair that has jewels and all sorts of things hanging off it. And I believe that this is the chair that was made by Hephaestus, also known as Vulcan in the Roman mythology, Hephaestus in the Greek mythology. For his mother, Hephaestus gave it to his mother Hera, and Vulcan gave it to his mother Juno. Of course, she didn't know at that time that this was her son that was giving it to her, and that the chair would entrap her. And I think that's what we're going to find that these lines are, that they're securing this woman in place. Just as this object is here, it has what appear to be attachments to the bottom of her dress, and there appear to be objects and chains and connectors and things running down this floor. We won't go into all of those here, but this golden thing that goes in here is, I believe, a golden lasso that's around her leg. And you can see that at least a little bit as it goes through, and it seems to loop around and then come out through the side of the dress. And it's not something you'd notice if you were standing back and looking at the painting at probably normal viewing distance. You might notice it's a little bit patchy. This has been cleaned off by someone, by the way. There's a bit of the varnish has been removed. Someone's been checking the age of the painting at some stage. And as you can see, the back half of the painting is pretty much intact. I think the front half has had a little bit of cleaning off done on it. Now, the child is, I believe, Vulcan or Hephaestus, and the woman is obviously Juno or Hera, depending on whether you want to do the Greek or Roman version of the tale. And of course, her sin was that she kicked the child from Mount Olympus because he was severely disfigured, and she was so revolted by his appearance that she kicked him down off the mountain, and he tumbled down and became lame in the process, and he plunged into, I think, the ocean and was raised by oceanids, and he came back to become the greatest artisan and craftsman the world has ever known. And you'd have to think that the artist might be saying a little bit about himself in this, perhaps immodestly, but I think we'll find that that's the tale that's being told here, and it's told by this woman having a reasonably fancy arm covering with some symbolism and a ring on her fingers there. It's partly hidden behind what I think is part of the basket here. The child also has some jewels and chains, etc., that are helping him hold the basket. So in both the genre painting he has something, but he also has all this sort of silver work that's hanging down. There's a little dog, I believe, on the top of half of his chest that's on a chain. He has a large jewel in the centre of his head and a large symbol on the top of his head, and his face is severely disfigured. We'll have a look at that in detail when we get to the detailed part of this little overview. And the woman has jewels in her hair and a little tiara or diadem on the front of her head, and she also has a symbol on her head as well. So what we're seeing here is a far more complex painting than it appears, and it certainly doesn't relate to the De Hoog painting. The other thing you need to be aware of is that I believe that this is the statuary of a temple that's been hidden in the light and shadows here. These are quite complex shapes, and this is obviously not a close-up photograph of it, but when you view this at the right angle, you can see that all these things are heading upwards, and this does appear to be some sort of statuary. Now, it's all a bit bizarre, but we'll have a look at a few of the little details at least, but most of it's tucked away in the series. I mean, there's even symbolism, etc., on this door, on the window mullions, and certainly around this archway. There seems to be reflections that don't relate to this story, this scene, this genre part of it. They seem to relate to something else, and I assume that that's the history part of this story. So it's pretty courageous for someone to paint a complete painting that appears to be two stories in one. We'll have a look to see if there's any substance in what I've just told you in the final part of this little overview. We will zip in and have a look at some of the fine details. We can't do all of it, but we can do a couple of little bits of it. So let's get in and have a look at that now. Before we get into the detail of looking at the little things that stitch this painting together, I just want to go back and have a quick look at underpaint in the painting, because people who've looked at Vermeer's later paintings might not understand how deliberate but very casually painted the underpainting is in paintings like The Little Street. First of all, let's just go to my painting, because these are the things I think might confuse a few people. If you have a look at the boy's head, you'll see this yellow underpaint here, and then it goes to green, and the green, I believe, pretty much occupies all of where his face is, and this green actually comes across from here. You'll see green in the underpaint in the shadow area of this part of the painting, and it sort of comes up at a bit of an angle across here. But you'll also notice that this artist is quite happy to leave gaps. The green runs along the edge of the hair there, where the wall colour comes down, and he's got a little bit of a gap there between the inside of the archway. And you'll see also in the colours around the woman's head, there's actually a little bit of a margin being left around the edge of the woman's head in a brown colour, which gives the head actually a bit of a silhouette, and that's actually a technique that's quite common to Vermeer. But you'll also see that there's green behind this part, and when you get further up into the light, there seems to be either a yellow or an ochre underpaint in that part. You'll notice the little margins that he's left in between certain areas. He's very casually painting a bit of pink, a bit of greeny yellow, and yellow there, a bit of pink on that top of that wall, and down here obviously green, etc. So let's have a look at the Little Street and see whether there's anything similar in the paint treatment. Now, I've already mentioned how casually the edges are painted here, and of course he is painting lime wash, and lime wash does run over the edges of, say, this bit of woodwork. That'd be quite normal for a bit of lime wash to get on the edge of the woodwork, so he's done it for a reason, but he's also, I think, just enjoyed the casualness of it. But if you have a look at this woman standing in this frame, she's framed in this doorway, it's really well done. But have a look at the underpaint colours, and you'll see there's a brown sort of terracotta colour under there. He's put a big patch of blue here, but then just ended it. Just let it, just left it sort of, sitting on the back of the woman. It goes, there's a little bit pale down there, perhaps it's part of the same thing, and a little dab of bluey white down the bottom here, just to make sure that her feet don't disappear. And you'll see down here that he's got this taupey colour with yet a lighter sort of underpaint, and then you get down the front here and he's got a bit of green. And so his colours change all the way through, and he uses the underpaint and the overpaint interchangeably in various areas of his paintings. Really quite casual, so very, very similar to what I've got on my painting. Now let's have a look at the detailed underpainting, because that's where things get particularly interesting. Even though we're in a photograph that's a fair way away from everything, I think you'll be able to pick up the underpainting along the edge of the boy's sleeve here. These appear to be some sort of a textural thing that I mentioned before. There's a leather or something that sticks out from the edge of the boy's jacket, and it's detailed all the way along in this underpainting. It's quite unusual. They're like spikes or horns that stick out, not unlike the ridges on the jacket of the boy in the little street. You'll see when he gets around here, this turns into a rope. Somehow there's a rope that possibly goes over his shoulder and comes around, and it goes down and attaches to the basket, and it's a beautifully painted knot there. Also pretty much in this underpaint colour, and the basket is also pretty much in that colour as well. The woman has underpainting visible just around the edge of her sleeve there, and I'll go to that in some detail in the series. The boy's face has a green underpaint by the look of it. You can just see it there, it's blurring out. I'll go to better images in a minute. But there's also shadows with a greeny yellow sort of colour in them, and I'll show you what those shadows are later because they're a bit surprising. And the woman's face is also painted with the green underpaint. See the green all through here. Very thick paint on her cheek, contoured at the very edge to create the silhouette of her face. Now don't worry too much about the lump that you see at the top of her head there, because there's actually something sitting on the outside of that. I can't quite pick it up, but I have had it appear as a line at times, so I'm not quite sure what's going on with that bit of a head, whether there's some eruption in the paint underneath, or whether there's something that I can't work out on the very edge of her face there. But you can just pick up also, I think, the way that he's graduated the paint towards the back of her neck. It gets thinner and thinner, and you can actually see some more brush strokes appearing so that the green shows through, and he creates shadow here. So whoever this artist is, he's been painting in a very similar way to Vermeer. We're going to have a quick whiz around the painting and look at some of those small details and some of the anomalous objects, the things that look wrong in the painting. But I just want to take you back to this image where we showed the light that hits between the boy's feet on the ground, and I think this light's correct because of this yellow in the white here and the pink in the white there. But what I want to use it for is to show you that there's two paintings going on here, and this illustrates it. So this is the boy's proper right shoe, and the toe cap is just here. So you can see it. You can see these golden flashes coming off the side of it. I suspect that they're something to do with the mythological painting, but I'll show you something that definitely is to do with the mythological painting. If you just have a look at this bit of silver that runs down the front of his leg, and just look at what happens to it. It actually runs straight across the tongue of his shoe, so it actually almost sits on the outside of his shoe, or the outside of his leg. It's not really part of the painting beneath. It's a painting almost over the top of it. You can see how finely detailed it is. This is not some sort of an accidental thing. This has actually been painted in. So this sits somewhere over the top and something hangs down the front. And obviously no street vendor in a genre painting is going to be wearing something with silver details on it. You can also see some of the finely detailed things on his shoe. Now I don't know what painting they're part of, but if you just notice up the left side of his leg there, there's what appears to be some sort of a brace or a wedge. Whether I think it runs into his shoe, it could wrap around his leg, I'm not sure. But this leg has some sort of a problem and it has a brace next to it. This other leg has something next to it as well. But the main thing to note is that what we'll be looking at from now on is effectively two paintings in one. The painting that's the genre painting and the history overlay, the mythological story that overlays it. This shoe is fairly interesting actually, because when you get down to the toe cap, in the series I show that there's a little winged figure on it. That little tiny thing just there is a winged figure. Incredibly small detail. Even the shoe's not particularly big, it's probably about 20 millimetres long. But what I want to use this little illustration of the fact we're looking at two things for is just to start looking at this apron, because you can't trust anything in this painting. This patch of white at the very bottom of the painting on the woman's skirt looks a bit unusual. It looks like it's been added by someone else later, but I don't think it has, because if you look at the top of it, you'll see a circular ring, semicircular ring with some dots on it. And I think what we're seeing there is that this is actually part of something, and it's probably part of something that's got, perhaps even has a structure that goes further up. So this is the trouble with this painting. You've got to assume that everything is actually right until you can actually show that it's definitely wrong. Even things like this mark here that hangs down, there's something underneath it. And that actually goes further down and seems to attach to this strange yellow loop that goes around. Now, I'll show you a bit more of what some of these things are. For example, on the outside, it appears that the apron is either non-existent or it's been painted out by the artist. But I'm not convinced that that's the case, because if you have a look, something comes down here and it bunches through a small gathering just here. And then it goes up again. So I'm not convinced that this apron is not exactly as it's meant to be. And when we have a look at the top of it, I think it'll show that that's definitely the case. So if we go up to the top of the apron, and I'll brighten this image up a little bit so that we can see things a bit more clearly. Interestingly, you'll notice all these little dots of light across the woman's skirt. Just coming back to this apron, and this is why I say you can't trust it, because it looks like it's absolutely nothing there. But if you have a look at it, you can see a tie running through there, a piece of fabric that goes through a loop, and there's a lovely diaphanous little bit of a fold of material there. So, I mean, the quality of the painting is sort of shown up just in that one little tiny detail there, which is only a couple of millimetres long, or a few millimetres long. Just incredibly well painted. You'll see that this comes down here, and there's a button that's a little triangular fabric's connecting to there. And if we follow this loop of the thing down a bit further, you'll see this loop buttons onto something there, and there's a little button just there. So the apron, although it looks extraordinarily casual, has been very deliberately painted. I'm not convinced by these mortar lines though, because they do run straight across the top of the painting, and I don't know whether they have been added in by someone afterwards. There's a strange gill shape that hangs down from under her arm. And I think this sort of terracotta colour might have been added over the top of it. But that actually runs straight down and forms part of the sort of a hidden apron, and it seems to have some possibly some drawings or symbols on it. It's a bit hard to see. Well, it's very hard to see, but it does seem to have something on the outside of it, which is unusual. Now, I'm not sure how it fits in. See, that's the thing that comes down and joins on to this curve at the bottom that we saw that bunches. So the thing with this painting is you can't make assumptions that things are not correct until you actually get in and have a look at the fine detail, and I haven't been able to expose all of the detail. I mean, you can even see that there's something going on there. I can't look at all of these things. There seem to be connections going back all over the place. Okay, let's move on to another bit that's a bit strange. I pointed out when we looked at the little street that the boy's shoes had strange knobs on them, or the shoe that you can see has strange knobs on the side of it. And I'm not suggesting that these shoes are the same by any means, but I think what he's done, what this artist has done, is he's used what was a real shoe and picked a feature of it, and he's created some sort of a mythological effect on the shoe itself, using the same knob structure that must exist on a real shoe. I suspect it was something like a waterproof covering that buttons down on the shoe or something in Little Street. And in this one, you can see it almost looks like a bit of a lightning flash or something at the side. Quite bizarre. Clearly not part of the shoe. That's the toe cap of the shoe there. And the shoes seem to extend right out of the earth, and when you go down lower, it looks like he's standing on some sort of a sandstone structure of some sort. You can see the little winged figure that I referred to just on the toe cap of his shoe. This is the toe cap here. So I think this is only about 1 millimetre or so, incredibly small. I also mentioned that there's an object on the ground just right behind the woman's skirt, and I'm not sure what it is. It's quite elaborate. When you get in and have a look at the detail on it, there's some sort of a yellow ball here. It looks like it's got jewels on it that hangs off the end of it. It's a sort of a terracotta red structure, and it has metal work on it as well. Somehow this metal appears to connect to the hem of the woman's skirt, and it seems to be the case all the way around the skirt, that there's something holding the woman's hem of her skirt down. So I'm taking these as a depiction of metal, because I can see what looks like a bolt or something at the bottom, and I can see something that looks like it's going through holes in her skirt to other buttons along the edge. But whether I'm misseeing something, I don't know, but that's the way I'm reading it at the moment. And you can see a little of the object that's behind the woman's skirt here. It runs around here somehow, goes up. I'm not sure what else sticks out of it, but you can see something that comes out of the side of it just here. That appears to have some sort of a knob on the end of it that hangs down, and this almost looks like a leg that comes forward, but extremely hard to see. And we're obviously, the photographs look pretty ordinary because we're filming through a sheen of dirt across the painting. When this is cleaned up, hopefully we'll be able to see exactly what this is supposed to be and whether or not it's something of importance or not. But it's certainly an object that doesn't appear in the De Hoog painting, just as the object to the left of the chair back doesn't appear in the De Hoog painting, just as the buildings that are opposite are quite different in the De Hoog painting. So now I want to see whether we can make sense of this seat on the chair. It's a very strange overstuffed looking cushion, which is completely different from anything Vermeer painted. And I want to see if there's an explanation for it. And now this image has obviously been darkened deliberately to try and provide a little bit more contrast between the dark and the light. I was constantly struck by how strange this edge was. It seemed to be beautifully painted in terms of its effect. I thought it might be fur and this might be some sort of feature in the fur, but I couldn't work it out. And then I looked at this area that was dark in the middle of it because I thought there might be a cushion here like De Hoog's chair in some way. In fact, I think that it shows that it's in some way tacked onto the edge of the chair, and there's a big turnover edge there that you can see. But it's this dark area that's interesting, and if you have a look in the dark area, you can actually see something. It's up to you what sort of shape you think this is. Obviously we're getting quite magnified now, so it might have lost a bit of detail, but to me it's a horse. And the horse is towing something which I believe is a cauldron, and off in the distance behind it here there's a chariot. So you've got a horse flying across some sort of a landscape, towing this cauldron, and out of the top of the cauldron I believe that fire is coming, and it's lighting the top of the sky. So this is the chariot of Apollo, or Helios as he was originally, and then sort of morphed into Apollo in the stories. And he's being towed across the morning sky and lighting the sky from the east. And this is the sky being set alight to. I think that he's flying over a volcanic landscape. This might be a volcano and a caldera of a volcano, and this could be a lava flow. And the reason I think that's relevant in this painting is that in the early 1650s, Mount Etna, which is the biggest active volcano in Europe, erupted, and it erupted for some considerable period. And I imagine that if you were someone who wanted to see one of the wonders of the world in all of its majesty, you would have taken a trip down to Sicily, if you could, to have a look at it. It's just the sort of thing a young artist might choose to do. And on the way, of course, he could become well and truly exposed to Italian painting. And certainly Vermeer was known to have good exposure and good understanding of Italian painting, but it's not quite known, well, it's not known at all, in fact, how he got that exposure. So here's something that might stitch it together. Of course, that would depend on whether Vermeer had anything to do with this painting, but at least at that time we know that Etna was erupting and spewing its volcanic material. And interestingly, of course, in mythology, the workshop of Vulcan or Hephaestus was beneath Mount Etna. So the whole thing sort of stitches together if that is indeed a horse, and if that chariot is lighting the morning sky. So let's have a bit more of a look at that. As we get in closer, the horse is harder to see, but let's start with the chariot because the wheel helps us here. You can see this thing with a red dot in the middle with some spokes around it, or what could be spokes, and a tub here. And I think that's the tub of the chariot. It might be I don't know whether it's a two-wheeled or a four-wheeled chariot. And the little figure of Apollo is this little chap right at the back here. And I think this is the symbol, which is a harp on the front of it. So if we go now across to the front and try to find this horse, it's just here is the head of the horse, and you can see its eye just to the right of this little hand thing, and its bridle here. Its neck comes around, and that's its foreleg coming down, and its hoof is down here, and it has jewels around the top of its foreleg and around its head, and there's a plumage up above its head, a decorative plumage. Now, it also has some sort of a armour plating on its belly, and this is its back leg with some sort of armour plating on its rump as well. I've got some better images of this in the actual main series, but this is the cauldron here. It seems to have something like a hugely hot coal on the back of the horse, and the cauldron is being towed, and you'll see the fire spewing up from the top being lit. And it's just, if you look inside a fireplace, or a glass-doored fireplace, you see what happens when fire licks across the top of a fireplace, and it looks exactly like that to me. And if you zoom in at this little bit here, you'll see these little embers falling back to earth. Beautifully painted. This to me is one of the absolute highlights of the painting. These little things just streaking back to earth, and of course providing our daylight. So this, I think, is depicting a mythological story within a mythological story, if you like. There's other horses that sort of stretch off in the distance here as well, I believe. But the problem with it, of course, is that bridle on the horse is only about the size of the head of a pin. So if it's real, and if these jewels, etc., around the foreleg are real, then they must have been painted by someone using a magnifying device. You couldn't paint it any other way, of course, because you couldn't even see it. I think these could well be serpents leading the horses, and I realise the whole thing's a bit of a stretch of imagination, but one of the things that we do as humans is we can pick out shapes extremely well, shapes that are familiar to us, and to me I see that as the shape of the head of a horse with an eye just there, and I see that as a decorative plumage. So it's a matter, I don't know what you'll see, and I certainly see this as a chariot wheel, and I believe that's a chariot with a little driver in the back of it there, Apollo, and that's his harp above it. All coincidental shapes perhaps, and it's a matter of what each of us sees, I suppose, but when it's cleaned we'll know the answer. Now, just to give you a bit of size relativity so you can work out why it is that things are quite difficult to see, from the nose of the horse, which I think is there, and there you can see its eye just there, and this is the plumage that I mentioned. From that nose right across to the outside of the chariot is about 18 or 19 millimetres. So that's less than 3/4 of an inch across the whole thing, which is the reason you'd have a little bit of trouble seeing the detail perhaps. Even in this image, I think you can start to pick up some of the armour plating, etc., on the edge of the horse. this big cauldron and this wonderful fire across the top. In the series, I spent a fair bit of time looking at this back wall and what appears on it. It's difficult to work out, just like everything else in this painting, but it seems that these patterns and the colours of the patterns are far more than you would expect to find just from light through a window. So my feeling is that this is part of the mythological story, and you can see certain shapes and that look like a bit of statuary in here, and edges of silver details, etc. So I think there's something far more going on in this part of the painting than just light on a wall. And in fact, you can see all sorts of patterning there, and what looks like some part of a column just there, little pointed thing there. And what's interesting is these flow over onto this, what looks like a painting. I don't believe it is a painting. I believe it's just made to look like a painting, just to confuse us. So, and again, this all goes right up to part of a column. And these shapes also are disguised within this woodwork as well. This woodwork is far more detailed than it should be, all the way down. So I think there's a lot going on in this painting that's a bit deceptive. And even the same on this door, even on the tops of this door, there's what look like shapes that look a bit temple-like. You can see that there is detail in all of this, but I won't go into it here. What I want to do is to finish off this little synopsis of the whole story by jumping straight to have a look at the woman's head and then the child's head, because a lot of the fine detail that we've been talking about is within those two areas. And also, particularly in the woman's head, there's considerable reference to Vermeer's technique, so we'll go and have a look at that in a bit of detail. I printed out some full-size copies of the painting so that I could study it a bit more closely without damaging it. This is just an iPhone photograph of a ruler laying on top of one of the copies of the painting, so you can just get an idea of how small the woman's head actually is. So let's have a closer look at the woman's face. Now, you recall from the little image I just showed you that from the very edge of her hair down to where the flesh part of her face disappears is about 30 millimetres, so it's about 1.25 inches. Now, just to give you some context, the face of the woman in the doorway in Vermeer's Little Street, where he painted people from across the road, the woman sitting in the doorway, I think her face is about 1/3 the size of this. And of course, in that painting, Vermeer made no attempt to show facial features, although he did show some colours. So this is a larger face, but it's of course nowhere near as large as faces like Girl with a Pearl Earring, these giant faces. This is still a very, very small face. It's about the size of the tip of your finger. If we get in a bit close, first of all, you can see some of the colours of the underpaint, and this is interesting because under the hair you can see it's this reddish brown colour where he's left this little margin at the edge, and I'm in two minds about whether or not this is overpaint here where he's put a bit of green on it. I think it probably is. I think the brown probably continues down because you can see brown through there, and then you can see green here and green down on her cheek. So this is an area where shadow is going to be created. So where he was going to create shadow, he's put this green underpaint, which is really interesting. And then it goes to grey here. So it's very hard to see that this painting is a copy of de Hoog's painting because so much thought's been given to the construction of it. If you have a look on the cheek, you'll see this flesh tone is very thick in the centre, and in fact he's painted these arcs of light. Whoever's painted it has painted these arcs of light, and this is refracted light. This is how light passing through an object appears. That's why you've got this absolute white bright highlight at the top of it, and then it graduates down towards yellow and pink, etc. And you get this shadow on the inside of a curve, and I show that in some detail in the longer series. But you've got this very thick paint on the cheek, and just tapered paint on or contoured on the very edge of the face. And with basically two types of underpaint, you can't even see an edge to the nose. It doesn't even appear to have a line. I'm not too sure about this reddish-brown shadow under the nose. It looks like it's been daubed on at a later time, and it's even got some sort of ragged marks to the edge of it. So I'm not 100% sure about it, but it certainly from a distance it looks fine. But when you get up close like this, of course, it looks like it doesn't belong at all. Now, as the woman's face graduates towards the neck, you can see that the paint thins out again, and he seems to have a bit of brown there in the underpaint, a darker brown. This grey might actually be part of a lace collar, I think. I'm not 100% sure about that. And then you've got this green colour here, and this, I think, is overpaint. It looks different from, so look at that green there. If you look at that, and then you look at what it looks like there, which is part of an underpaint. It's slightly different colour. This is slightly yellower, and I think it's been affected by this pink. It's been painted over the top, I think. So he's had a whole lot of different ways of painting this woman's face. You can just see this little margin of a line, just where the thumb of this little thing is. You can just see this little margin of a line just running down there. I think that's actually the edge of her face, and I don't know what's going on with the paint in that location. Now, the little tiara shape that's in her hair, the bottom of it's about there, and we'll go in and closely and have a look at some of the details of it. It's very hard to see. You can see that there's these columns that run up the front of it, and they seem to have some symbols on the tops of them. And there's one that's right in the centre there, which seems to go up much higher, and there's sort of a leaf shape around here and around here and around part of that. A bit hard to pick up the edges. I think it'll clean up. We will see what the edges look like, but very interesting and unusual shape, and clearly not something that a woman buying apples in a doorway in Holland in the 17th century would have in her hair. And you can see that there's also some really elaborate object right at the front of her forehead, and this would be symbolic of the way that gods were depicted. And so that's why I think this woman is Juno or Hera. So I think that she is being depicted as a goddess. If you go into her hair a bit, you'll see there's a bit here that looks a bit like a column of a temple, and this looks like bone. So it's a fabulous depiction of a piece of perhaps whalebone or something. I don't know. There's obviously something elaborate there, and you can see this very elaborate little jewel with its cross-hatched silver connector, red stone and yellow stone. That's only about 1 millimetre across that thing. So clearly this was painted with some magnification. Just while we're here, it's interesting to have a look at the anatomy of a crack in a painting developing. If you have a look just here, this is a crack that's yet to fully open up, and you can see that the paint is still hanging on right across the top of it, and then as it starts to open, you'll see little bits of paint sitting on the shoulder of the cracks, and it starts to, and you can see the underpaint colour underneath. So really quite interesting how cracks open up in paintings. Now here's a little detail that I find quite fascinating. I thought this was just a hair stuck in the painting, and it comes down here, but it actually seems to have a silver or some sort of little painted object on the end of it. But if you follow it along, it seems to zigzag a bit, and at this point here it branches, and it comes around to a little leaf shape, and it goes across here, and there's some other painted objects and leaves and bits and pieces under there, and it goes off. Now what it's supposed to depict, I'm not quite sure. I don't know that human hair does that, but you can see how tiny it is compared to the size of that crack. These cracks give an indication of just how old this painting is. In fact, you can see the mixture of pigment in the paint as well. So this is a very old painting, but Yeah, just a fascinating little object which appears to be painted. I think there's a leaf on that side as well, and there's one just painted here. Little gossamer sort of a leaf. Now, as to what it is that's refracting this light, I'm not 100% sure whether it's light coming off this headpiece that she's wearing, coming down this way. That would be logical because the direction of the light would be coming from there. But I also can see some elaborate things in this area, and in different photographs you see quite detailed objects across, or details of objects across her hair. It's very hard to pick out what they are. Like there's one there, it's a black stone with a silver edge around it. And you've got this coral colour in the back of her hair. And I think this is a painted object, this thing here, which looks like the cat's walked across the painting. I think these appear in a range of places, and some of them are particularly detailed, and they look like they're painted silver with the little connectors. So I think they're actually incredibly tiny painted objects. But I think the main thing of interest in terms of Vermeer is this graduation of paint as you head towards shadows, the thickness of paint in the areas that are catching the most light, the use of both green underpaint, which was an Italian technique, which was to complement the flesh tones and I think tone them down a little bit as well probably, but also what looks like to me like a bit of green overpaint as well. But it's very easy to think how odd the painting looks with all these strange marks in the paint and bubbles and bits of colour missing and contours at the edge. It's very easy to think of how strange it looks and forget how tiny that face actually is. And as you move back towards a more normal viewing distance, you can see how the edge of her face just picks up a little bit of a dark shadow. It even shows her lips. You can see her nose, even though when you look at the painting up close, there's no definition on the edge of her nose. It's all been achieved by just contouring the paint at the very edge. Anyway, we'll now move on and have a quick look at the boy's face, because that's interesting. And we won't go into any more detail in this overview because it's already become far too long. The boy's face is also extremely small. So measuring from the very top of the bonnet to the point of his chin is about 35 millimetres, but the flesh part of his face, from his chin to his hair, is about 23 millimetres, so less than an inch. His hair at the centre of his head is about 6 millimetres, so about a quarter of an inch, and his bonnet's pretty close to a quarter of an inch as well. So we're talking extremely tiny sizes. We will come back and have a look at this mark in the middle of his head, which is a jewel. And so it's worth noting just here that it's only 3 millimetres long. Obviously a lot narrower than that. Just while we're here, you'll notice that there's what appears to be a random jewel of some sort just sitting on this wall. I'm not quite sure what it is, but it certainly does appear to be something that's got pearls and things in it. The light catches it. It's a really interesting shape. I'm not going to go into it in this little summary, but it's a really interesting object. And why it's there, I'm not quite sure. It's like a lot of things in this painting I'm not quite sure of. It's interesting that terracotta red colour that's under the nose of the woman seems to be a bit repeated here. It's the colour of that brick wall. And it's also interesting that this sort of runs over the edge of the boy's bonnet. So either the artist has come back and put it in afterwards, or someone else has come along and put it in. So yeah, I hadn't noticed that before. It's a bit unusual. It's like as if this little bit of wall wasn't here and it's been painted in. I wonder what it looked like when that wasn't there. This is that strange jewelled object that sits on the wall. It seems to have some sort of metal componentry to it and something that hangs down here, but it's been painted out by this terracotta colour. Although I absolutely love the way this pink colour catches light going across the top of it. So I think that's the original painting. I'm just not completely convinced about this terracotta colour, and I mentioned before that I wasn't convinced about some mortar lines that have been painted in. They seem unusual. But anyway, let's look at the boy, because we're just going to have a quick look at his hair. I'm pretty confident that there's all sorts of jewellery depicted in his hair, but there is a large central object in his hair. This is like a wire clip that seems to be holding it, and as you can see, that's the size of a crack, and this is painted, and it's smaller than the width of a crack, and it curves right around here. How it's been done, I don't know, but it's quite clearly cracked. It's broken as it's gone across this crack. So it appears to be a silver metal object of some sort. It has a tongue that comes out and then hangs down the front of it, and some objects that hang off it. And it also has some aspects to it there which are quite large. So I think this could be the symbol of the god, because that's where it's been depicted in other paintings and drawings, up in the hair. So this could be the symbol for Vulcan or Hephaestus, depending on whether you prefer the Greek or the Roman. As we come down his face, we hit this jewel that appears right in the middle of his eyebrows. And as I mentioned, it's about 3 millimetres long from top to bottom, and it's probably about 1.5 millimetres from the main parts that we can see, although I think it does extend across here a bit. I can see some further aspects to it out there. But it has a ring here that it appears to hang from, and there's this tendril that runs down one side which has some red stones and black stones set in it, and then it has what appear to be little pearls on this side. Now, it's difficult to photograph this thing. It's only tiny, and to get clarity in the photographs, so that's why it always looks a little bit blurry. But I'm pretty confident that it's a painted object. It's not just some sort of damage to the painting that's pushed paint up in a strange way. I mean, I don't think you get pearls and stones set in, silver, etc. Now, as we move across towards his proper right eye, you find that he actually doesn't have an eye. The eye appears to be missing. And there's a silver jewel in front of it with a yellow stone in it. Actually appears a bit more to have a silver surround around it, and a little chain coming down from it that curves back towards his eye. So there's something hanging here in front of this eye, and the eye appears to be missing. There does appear to be an eye on the other side, but I think this boy has got a damaged face, and when we go back and have a look at his hair, I think this is a chunk of hair that's missing as well. That's why it's been depicted in this way, with all these multicolours, etc. So this is a child that's been severely injured in some way, and of course that fits with the mythological story, but it also fits with the major event that happened in Vermeer's early career, when there was a gunpowder explosion in Delft, and about 1 in 20 people in the town were injured, and some very severely. And of course there would have been all sorts of people walking around with very nasty looking wounds, and I wonder whether this little child, this little street vendor, is one of the people that has suffered those wounds. The other possible Vermeer reference is that one of his own children, thought to be his eldest son, was severely injured in a boat explosion, but that was much later, and I think this is a relatively early painting. If it's a Vermeer painting, I'd love to fit it with a personal story and say that this was his own son that he was painting, but I think it's probably unlikely. I think you can see that jewel a little bit better in this photograph, and you can start to see some of the silver surrounds of this object as well, and how finely painted it is. And you can just pick up little glints of objects that are coming down here. Some of these things will be dust. Some of these marks on the painting, I inadvertently picked up a piece of dust when I took the photographs of the painting, and it's hanging on the bottom of here, which is a bit disconcerting, but that bit there is actually painted. Now, let's see if we can pick up some of the other injuries on this boy's face. And the artist is giving us a big clue as to where they are. This little thing here, it took me a while to realise, but it's got a hole in it, and there's a chain that runs across to the other side and connects over here somewhere, and there's a little connector at the top of it as well. This is actually a bandage, and you can see another little silver wire just coming off there. So the artist has actually painted this kid with a bandage on his face, and you'll see another one down here in the bottom right corner. See this little triangle that comes off the side of his face, and it has actually has a little silver edge on the top, and there's some sort of a wire mechanism hanging off the side here, and a little connector on the end just there. I'm pretty confident that that's a bandage as well. So this is really quite unusual and unheard of. There's an object down the left side of his face. You can just pick up those brown marks there, and you might just see it looks like some sort of a leather strap that runs around this side of his face, and there's a big bulge to it there. So I think that again is part of some sort of a dressing on his face, some sort of an object that's holding the side of his face, because it took me a while to realise his face is actually not symmetrical. This side and this side bulges out, so it should be there. Now this is not an artist who didn't know what he was doing. He's deliberately bulged that out for a reason. You'll see this top lip has melted virtually over. It's not. There's something wrong with it. It's hanging down here over part of his bottom lip. His teeth are visible through there, but there's also something coming out of here. Either his lip or his tongue is sticking out. So he's been made to look disfigured, which fits completely with the mythological story. You can see this tongue mark a little bit better in this photograph, perhaps. Now, that's where I think that thing is a bandage, and I think all of this green shading on this side of his face tapers nicely towards the edge or contours, so you can pick up his face all right in the contour, but I think that's a bandage on his face, and I think this silver thing running through it is some sort of a connector as well. And wounds in those days would have been, pretty rudimentary in the way they were treated. Would have cost a lot of money to have this sort of treatment, which made me think it might be the son of someone important, but I'm not too sure about that. So this painting's hiding a lot of secrets. I found some more, but I'm not going to go into them here. I think I've gone on far too long with what's supposed to be just a summary of the series. In terms of the Vermeer aspect, you can see it becomes a bit of a problem, because to paint this in the style of Vermeer, you needed quite a few things to go your way. You needed to find a canvas of the right proportions. They had to be the same proportions as the De Hoog painting, and of course you had to have access to the De Hoog painting, which wasn't publicly available till about 1900. It was in private collections in France before that. And then despite having that, the artist in this painting has undertaken detailed underpainting, some of which is visible on edges, and a lot of it's visible when you look closely in terms of the colours of the underpainting that define the light and shade in the painting. And whoever it is has painted that in a very similar way to Vermeer. And of course you would have needed strong references to a number of Vermeer paintings. You would need to know about the way Vermeer has painted light in his View of Delft, probably to pick up the use of these three different coloured highlights and the swirls of colour, etc. The View of Delft would also help you to paint this arch in the same way that Vermeer's painted his archways and these walls in the View of Delft, these big dabs of colour and twirly lines, fairly imprecise, probably not what most artists were doing, I imagine. The View of Delft would obviously also have to be relied on to come up with these very unusual wall colours where sunlight hits the wall directly. It would also obviously be helpful to have access to the Procurus in terms of the little reference that I pointed out down the bottom here, which was this strange colour combination. It appears just on this one spot on the painting, on the leg. Possibly just a bit of luck by the artist to get that right, but interesting nevertheless. And it would also, of course, in terms of what Mr. Leake said was the flashes of light or zips of daylight. Was that just another bit of luck by this artist, or did he know that Vermeer unusually painted in that particular way and decided to put this graduated zip of daylight down the edge of the door frame? So that was another bit of luck perhaps by the artist. And of course you couldn't have painted it at all in the style of Vermeer without having access to the Little Street, and otherwise you wouldn't have done these tiles with the 3 different colours, and you wouldn't have moved colour across the tiles in both directions, and you would also not have been quite so easygoing with the way colours ended and started, where sometimes just patches are left completely unpainted. The Little Street is one of the few paintings where that occurs, so it's quite unlike most of Vermeer's later paintings. So I guess if you were painting an outdoor scene like this and you were copying de Hoogh and painting in the manner of Vermeer, you might well just look at the outdoor paintings and you might work this bit out. But I still think you'd have to be enormously talented and have a very good understanding to be able to do it. And of course then there's the other similarities in the way the boy's dressed. There's these strange spikes and patterning on the edge of his jacket, and these strange lumps and bumps that come off the edge of his shoes, which are very similar to the little boy in the Little Street, and also the way the rope just comes off the edge of the basket, I think is also similar to the boy in the Little Street. So interesting number of overlaps between the two paintings. And those things, of course, are just related to painting in the style of Vermeer. Then we have what appears to be another complete story being painted over the top of the painting. So it shows 2 stories at the same time, which is extraordinarily inventive if that's what it is, and that's what it appears to be, to me at least. And not only does the artist invent that idea, but then he proceeds to paint these absolutely minuscule details on the woman, the boy, and the chair in particular. And I believe they're on the back wall, the door, and this wall, and possibly the inside of the arch. So what we're looking at is something very unusual. Now, I don't intend to take it any further on this little summary. I indicate in the series what I'm doing with the painting. Basically, I'm just waiting for some experts to have a look at it at some stage. And in the absence of being able to put the painting in the hands of the right people, I guess I'm counting on this information to hopefully pique the interest of the very small number of people who have very high level expertise in Dutch paintings of the 17th century. But in the meantime it's been sent away to be stored, and so it's safely kept, but it's very fragile and it can't travel any great distances. So thanks for watching this summary. If you're inclined to put yourself through the several more hours of watching the longer series, then I do manage to show you some other details that I haven't picked up in this little story. There's a few errors in the longer story which I've thought about since, but nothing overly significant in terms of the outcomes. And I guess if anything, in finishing this little summary, probably all I've managed to do for you and for myself is to unearth more questions. Questions about how it was painted, how it was viewed, how did the artist light it, how much should it be magnified, and I suppose from my perspective, whether or not you see the same things that I see in the painting. And if you don't, well, that tells me something as well. So I think I'll finish now. I'm satisfied that I've met my obligation to the painting. It's delighted me and confused me and confounded me for some 4 years now, but it's time to set it on its way and let other people decide whether it requires further investigation or whether it's just one of those paintings that's just going to drift off into history. So thanks very much for watching, and I hope that one day perhaps the questions that are raised here will actually be answered by someone.